I challenge Makora!
Why should I accept your challenge?
You want to make me suffer.
The MMORPG, massively multiplayer online role-playing game as coined by the creators of Ultima Online at the end of the last millennium, is a genre that made a bold promise. A promise of an endless adventure in a persistent world where a sense of wonder and exploration, player agency, and cooperation and conflict between players define the experience. But did they deliver on that promise? Well, my answer is a definitive no, and I'm here to give you my 2 cents on why all the major current MMOs we have are in fact static, finite games and are not actually that much different from single-player or smaller-scale titles from other genres that bombard you with an endless stream of DLC, seasonal content, battle passes, as the lines continue to blur between what my generation defined an MMORPG as and live service games centered around a mainly single-player experience that might lead up to a lobby for some PvE co-op or PvP group player endgame systems. Big disclaimer here, I am not here to shit on your current game. If you enjoy any of these titles in their current form or direction, I am legitimately happy for you the same way I'm happy for players that enjoy games in any other genre. So please try to be patient, let me cook, and hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. Now in my previous video I talked about why people, including myself, are still flocking to WoW Classic after nearly 20 years instead of trying out what any of the current MMOs have to offer. And to be frank, it's well because most of the games we call MMORPGs today are, for better or worse, no longer MMORPGs, at least not in my eyes, and I honestly think I'm not alone on this one. The genre itself has morphed into something else after 10 years of most titles trying to replicate WoW's formula in the search for the fabled WoW killer, followed by another 7 or 8 years of the genre being discarded as unprofitable by major studios due to the ultimate failure to achieve that holy grail. But take any MMO, be it retail World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, Elder Scrolls Online, New World, or even RuneScape for that matter. At any given time, the game is finite. You can theoretically reach a state of the game where you've done everything. You have done all the hardest dungeons and raids, collected all the mounts, pets, and cosmetics, maxed out all the skills, completed all the quest lines and achievements, or reached the highest bracket of the seasonal ladder, and all you have left is to wait for the next content patch or the next expansion to add more for you to chase, while circle jerking online with other people that know-life the game just as much as you did about declining player counts and its inevitable death. Obviously, the time investment required to achieve this is astronomical, and very, very few, if any, will ever reach that pinnacle. But the reality is, it is finite. It's just the illusion of endless content that keeps it all alive through a series of time sinks, time gating, or seasonal soft resets that are most of the time there to increase player retention and not so much because they are enjoyable or fulfilling experiences in themselves. What we are left with is a sense of disillusionment from longtime MMORPG players and content creators who find many reasons why they themselves or the wider public have seemingly grown out of the genre, or why it fails to pique the curiosity and imagination of the younger generations the way it did for us back in the day. And I think that comes down to the fact that deep down, many, including myself, still believe in that original promise of an adventure that never ends. But just like the studios managing the current dominant titles, I think we're missing the forest for the trees, and we have to admit that the formula that WoW promoted just cannot meet our expectations without being willing to take risks and evolve in today's gaming landscape. The reality is that with static, finite content, there is no version of the foreseeable future where a developer can put out new content faster than the most passionate or dedicated players can complete it, no matter how much they might want to or how hard they might try. And with so many titles on the horizon that promise to reinvigorate or reinvent the MMORPG, as well as many of the dominant franchises scrambling to find their identity and direction, I think now is the best time to actually take a step back and see what we can really learn from where we are if we want to break the cycle and truly ask ourselves what we want from the genre going forward. So let's go ahead and break it down. What is
The formula.
At this point, it boils down to an expedited leveling experience through linear quests, usually centered around a main story arc, with gear improvements that are most of the time meaningless. Higher level, better item, bigger number, better person. Just slap on whatever has the up arrow on it since nothing really matters before endgame, and virtually no reason to interact with other players along the way. And once you do hit max level, you are faced with some level of time sink to get a minimum character power to qualify for group content, ranging from mild to downright extreme. And after that, you're met with the choice of joining seasonal instance content, whether it be PvP or PvE, that has increasingly focused on becoming challenging and punishing to the point where it is gate-kept behind a long list of credentials in the form of inflated gear requirements and achievements or statistics monitored by third-party websites to even get invited as players scramble to attempt to not waste their time. And all of this in the pursuit of gear that you know will be made irrelevant in a few months by the catch-up mechanics implemented in the next season. But just because you might not have the time or skill to participate in group content, that doesn't mean you have to quit the game and stop paying your subscription or take down the active daily or monthly user count. Oh no. We got you covered with hundreds or thousands of mounts, cosmetics, achievements, time-gated weekly, daily, or even hourly that you can grind out seemingly until the end of time on your own, of course, without really needing to interact with anyone else for the most part. At this point, it feels like you're playing a single-player story game where once you complete the campaign, you have a choice of either joining a League of Legends seasonal ladder lobby or the PvE equivalent, an ARPG grind to beat the RNG gods and slowly increase your gear score, or a collection-based mobile game complete with a shop, just because you want more of whichever virtual world you invested a lot of your time into and don't want it to end because the experience of discovering it, either alone or with people that are now your longtime friends, meant so much to you in the first place. Now you might say that's just how MMOs work, right? What more is there? And that's exactly my point. While none of what I said is meant to necessarily imply negative things about the quality of any of these systems that make up the puzzle on its own, this formula has been normalized so much that it's easy to forget there was a time before World of Warcraft, a time where games like Ultima Online, EverQuest, Asheron's Call, Dark Age of Camelot, Lineage, or Star Wars Galaxies ruled the genre, albeit with much smaller player bases. World of Warcraft did throw the genre into the mainstream, and it was undeniably a huge leap forward from all of these titles in terms of graphics, mechanics, gameplay, lore, accessibility, and quality of life. But what many might not realize is that its success was a result of all these factors put together, and it was also lucky to launch at a time where access to online games was experiencing exponential growth, and the desire to meet and interact with people from across the world was still novel and exciting, since there was no global social media giants filling that gap just quite yet. So while we can probably debate this until the end of time, it's really hard to definitively say which of these things was truly necessary for it to achieve the success that it ultimately did. Another thing that WoW did was it stripped out or simplified a lot of the so-called sandbox features in previous titles. Open world PvP with consequences, from disputed outdoor content to the dreaded full loot, player-driven economies or systems that incentivize guild politics through the control of territory or logistics related to scarce resources were not part of the formula. And this is not a criticism, by the way. WoW was so good that it didn't need these features to be a complete and extremely immersive game. But that was 2004, before MMORPGs had entered the mainstream and before metagaming was really a thing. That means that people were not optimizing, in fact, far from it. Most people were slow. Myself, I was deliberately slow because I just enjoyed the experience. There was no FOMO making me feel like I have to rush to endgame and no feeling of being left behind on the hamster wheel, so I made it a point to do every single alliance quest in the game. Low-level quest that gives no experience anymore? No problem. Kill 30 mobs that are 15 levels lower, or take 2-hour detour to finish the quests in the Night Elf area just for the sake of it? You got it. No task too small, no trick across the map too great. It took me 5 months to get to max level and endgame, and I enjoyed every minute of it and even made some friends along the way that I still keep in touch with today. And as for endgame, it never had any dynamic elements. There was nothing the players could really do to actually change the world in impactful ways, whether in terms of content available in each zone, territory control, and there was some metagaming going on around certain resources, but resource scarcity was never a central aspect of the game or part of a complex player-driven system you might find in true sandbox titles. It didn't need any of this back then. The true endgame of World of Warcraft back in the day wasn't even really the raiding. It was the social aspects of the guilds organizing them, or the server politics and drama around good or bad actors, securing world buffs or dispelling them, or trying to climb the unforgiving PvP ladder while dueling with other terminally online people in front of Stormwind or Orgrimmar. Before social media, Discord servers, Twitter, WhatsApp groups, and YouTube or Twitch communities became as large as they are today, players maintained these friendships and relationships within the game itself without needing systems to actively reinforce it. As these third-party resources and communities exploded onto the scene and the desire to make the game less time-consuming and more accessible to the wider audience, a lot of the inconvenient time-wasting features in the game were removed, the leveling experience was streamlined and expedited to rush the player to endgame, matchmaking tools for group content were introduced to cut down the time spamming looking for tank in general chat, faster travel options or teleportation to instances was added to skip the 20-minute walk to a dungeon or raid, and the list can go on and on. This led to more and more people participating in the higher level of content simply because, well, it took less time, and therefore more people reached that fabled pinnacle of completion that broke the illusion of a promise of an adventure with no end in sight. What followed was a slow-burning conflict between the player base on one side, divided into those screaming for more endgame content and those disappointed at the increasingly shallow leveling experience and shift the focus away from the social aspects of the game, and on the other side, the developers that were more focused on improving player retention mechanics, increasing average daily users, and eventually revenue per user, rather than focusing on making a truly enjoyable game. The result was more and more time gating in the form of dailies and weeklies to throttle the most efficient and dedicated players, more difficulties for group content to increase the time commitment necessary to reach the pinnacle, or tens, hundreds, or thousands of 1% drop mounts collectibles, or sometimes downright insane achievements to appease the people without the time or ability to participate in increasingly difficult and time-consuming endgame loops. So without going on too much of a tangent here, that's where we are today. And I'm definitely not saying that this general formula that most games in the genre are following today is all bad and that your favorite MMO needs to die or radically change any more than I'm advocating for radical shifts in ARPGs or open world titles. Sure, there are some blatant problems like rampant FOMO or the monetization systems becoming the game itself, but apart from that, games following the formula laid out by World of Warcraft starting in its Wrath of the Lich King glory days are still managing to capture a decent audience and probably will do so for years to come. But they will never be that endless dynamic, ever-changing world that some people still crave when they get excited about a new MMORPG being announced, leaving a sense of nostalgia and a desire to go back to the good old days for those of us who, consciously or not, still believe in that original promise of a never-ending adventure. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below, but realistically, this is the choice before us. Number 1, we accept that this is what MMORPGs are now and realize it's okay to go out and touch grass from time to time if we completed the content and do, well, anything else until we eventually get more. And stop chasing the dragon by looking at these games like a fantasy version of Second Life, the Metaverse, The Matrix, or Ready Player One's Oasis in a futile search for a forever game. Or number 2, for those as far down the rabbit hole as I am, there is an alternative in theory at least. But first, we have to stop looking at the past for the solution. After all, isn't that what we're doing when we're playing classic hardcore right now? We know that the game has an endpoint, so we make it endless since we know that one day our character will die and we'll have to start all over again. But just think of all the ways the world and how we live our lives, not to mention how people play video games, have changed in the last 20 years. World of Warcraft Vanilla didn't need to focus on implementing dynamic features into the game to deliver at least the illusion of an endless adventure to the vast majority of its player base, but that was back in 2004. Alright, I know I just said that we have to stop looking to the past, but ironically, what if we look back even further? Instead of a bloated AAA studio deploying 1,000 people for 6 months to make content that degenerate poop socks like myself can go through in 2 weeks and scream for more, what if someone instead tried to reach for some of those long forgotten and discarded dynamic features that create systems that would incentivize players to create their own content and add friction organically? And no, I am not advocating for a full sandbox here either. Sandbox games have historically been labeled as extremely niche and often a cop-out by developers looking to not put in the work to create compelling lore or sound systems and leave the heavy lifting to the player base. So in the end, is it better to have a theme park MMO or a sandbox MMO?
I say, is it too much to ask for both?
Frankly, I'm astonished that it has been so rarely, if ever, attempted in the past 2 decades. A lot of the technological limitations that made these types of projects unfeasible at scale aren't there anymore and haven't been for a while now. And with the leaps and bounds in technology and even the prospect of AI applications in video games rearing its head on a not too distant horizon, exploring the possibilities of dynamic elements in MMORPGs to fulfill that promise of an endless adventure, I feel is worth it now more than ever. Yet in the mad rush to capitalize on the theme park formula that WoW used to launch the genre into the mainstream, there have been only a handful of at best moderately successful and often short-lived attempts to deviate from that in a significant way. The only notable examples I can think of we've seen are Warhammer Online that tried to resuscitate the realm versus realm formula of Dark Age of Camelot, but ultimately failed due to a general lack of content and mismanagement on the part of Mythic Entertainment and Electronic Arts. Arcade, that was a Korean MMO that launched in 2013, back before desperation had brought Asian titles into the Western mainstream spotlight, and despite having potentially revolutionary ideas for a dynamic endgame content following in the footsteps of the Lineage series, going so far as straight up labeling itself as the first truly sandpark MMO, it was promptly turned into a pay-to-win grindfest infested with rampant botting and server issues shortly after launch. And soon enough, XL Games are taking another stab at it with Arcade 2, due to launch sometime next year, this time with a different publisher, so that's one to cautiously keep an eye on. And even Albion Online, despite having a lot of features that are deemed a no-go for the genre, like being pay-to-win, having full loot PvP, being playable on mobile, having a limited number of abilities based on your gear without class restrictions, seasonal territory control wipes, local storage and auction houses, and a Destiny board that takes literal years/play to max out, still manages to hold a respectable player base, mostly because it manages to offer compelling activities that make anyone from the most hardcore to the most casual players feel like they are having an impact on the world through the player-driven economy, territory control, faction wars, crafting station ownership, or gathering and crafting systems. In fact, the disappointment with Arcade's failure was so profound that it actually inspired some of its players to make their own game you might have heard about, called Ashes of Creation, that has people divided into those that view it as the potential savior of the genre, and those that think it's simply another in a long string of complex MMO scams that will never launch and drag on for years and years to come. Personally, I am cautiously in the camp of the former, since if you follow the frequent development updates, it's hard to imagine that they aren't actually trying to make the best game that they can. It's only a question of whether they can succeed and how long it'll take, and I'm sure I'll be talking a lot more about this game and content going forward. But as always, that's just my 2 cents, and the point I'm trying to make is, I guess after 20 years, we're at least seeing that the industry is trying to use some systems and tools at their disposal that have been neglected in order to try and serve that forgotten player base that can't quite put their finger on what MMOs of the past could deliver that current ones cannot. We have many upcoming titles that are trying to implement dynamic features or even incorporate survival mechanics into the genre. And regardless of whether or not you enjoy the current state or direction of your favorite title, studios taking risks and trying to improve the genre can only be a benefit for us all as players in the long run. And if we're lucky, we might just end up with at least one game that manages to get it right and deliver on that long-forgotten promise. But anyway, I'm Jericho. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you again soon. Have a nice day.